Salutations, my morbid maggots! Joker here, welcoming you back to the Morbid Vale. Today, we have a story of power, ravenous gods, and an unholy pact. But first, if you haven't seen our previous build, Magnus the Great, then click the pop-up now to view it. We also have a friend joining us today, Mr. Elliot Slade. Unfortunately, that does mean I won't be giving the backstory, but I should be back for the stats and gameplay. Now, without any further ado, allow us to introduce you to the Reaper of Souls, the Grave Rider.
Legends have made up the lives of many mortals throughout the ages. Tall tales to help them make sense of things too great or too terrifying to believe. This is the legend of the Grave Rider. Story goes that there was one survivor of the attack on Sarthal, one man whose pain and anguish at the loss of his family was so great that his cries tore a hole in the fabric of reality. He fell through and landed in a sea of black ooze that began to suffocate him. As he neared death, 7 glowing gems appeared before him, and a voice emanated from each one, speaking in unison. The gems introduced themselves as the ideal masters, and recognized the potential that the man had within him. They offered to give him the power to avenge his family, but in exchange, they demanded 1,000 souls in 3 days. Eagerly, the man accepted the deal, and so the masters gave him an axe that would collect the souls of all that fell by the blade. They then sent the man back to Sarthal, and it didn't take him long to track down the snow elves. While the axe was indeed a powerful item, the ideal masters gave the man no supernatural powers to aid him in his quest of revenge. But to their surprise, his soul did not return to them within the 3 days. The ideal masters appeared before him, and to their amazement, he had done the impossible. With only an enchanted axe and his boiling rage, the man killed not 1,000, but 10,000 snow elves. His debt was paid 10 times over, and the ideal masters bestowed upon him great power and strength, more than he possessed before. He returned to Sarthal to bury his family, and when the returning men came to him, asking what happened, he told them that the snow elves attacked, but he killed them all. Scouts went out to see if the claim was true, and when they returned, their faces were frozen in horror. Elven men, women, and children, thousands upon thousands of bodies, littering the mountains and villages as far as the eye could see. From that day, the man was revered by his people, so much so that he was eventually given the title of Konarik and received a mask with his new position as High Priest and Warlord of the Dragon Cult. For 300 years he reigned as the mighty Warlord, for one of the blessings of the Ideal Masters was slow aging. But as the Dragon Priests came and gone, they became jealous and sought out their own forms of long life and immortality. One such priest was Mirak, who sought the aid of a Daedric prince. Hermes Mora revealed to Mirak that he had been born with the soul of a dragon, and taught him how to harness the power of the dragons for himself, convincing him that doing so would make him immortal. Mirak, however, wise and deceptive, knew that the Daedra were known to be tricky themselves, so he did not test this power while wearing his own attire. He made a replica of Konarik's mask, and wore it as he slaughtered several of his dragon masters. The soldiers and dragons who survived rallied to Alduin to tell him the news, and when the World Eater arrived, Mirak pretended to be wounded, saying that Konarik had fled back to Skyrim. Together, Alduin and Mirak defeated Konarik in combat, and his mask was stripped from him. Mirak gloated over Konarik, even hinting at the deception to overthrow him. Konarik tried to explain that he had not killed any of his dragon masters, but Alduin would not listen, and immediately ordered Konarik's execution. As the headsman's axe came down, Konarik was snatched away in a purple void. The Ideal Masters had saved his life and mended his wounds. They wanted to offer him another deal. They said that they would give him the power he needed to destroy Mirak and regain Alduin's loyalty. But in exchange, they wanted 500,000 souls. To their surprise, Konarik refused, but countered with another offer. He wanted not just power to avenge himself against Mirak, but to destroy Alduin as well. In exchange, he offered his eternal service to the Ideal Masters. Without hesitation, they accepted the deal. However, no power was given to Konarik. The Ideal Masters explained that the only power to destroy Alduin and Mirak resided in the blood and soul of the Dragonborns, and that he would have to wait for one to come to the Soul Cairn. He realized that he had been tricked, but it was too late, and Konarik was forced into submission by the Ideal Masters. He was tortured and twisted into the monster called the Grave Rider, and once every 100 years he was released in Tamriel to harvest the souls the Ideal Masters greatly craved. Then one night, as he rested in his pile of bones, he felt someone slay one of the keepers. He arose and watched as this strange warrior fought his way through the Soul Cairn. When Durnavir came to fight the warrior, the rider expected it to be a short fight, but was surprised when the warrior not only held his own, but successfully defeated Durnavir in combat. He overheard the conversation that the dragon had with the warrior, and learned that this was indeed a dragonborn. And because he was also a vampire, the rider knew exactly how he could gain his ultimate freedom. The Grave Rider was unable to leave the Soul Cairn in his natural form without the permission of the Ideal Masters, but the Dragonborn's soul was already weakened by Molag Bal's curse, and his body was strong enough to hold the rider's soul. As the Dragonborn prepared to leave the Soul Cairn, the rider possessed his body, and the two struggled for control. But the rider was a master of souls, and devoured the Dragonborn within his own body. With the full power of the Dragonborn, Molag Bal's blood, and his own mastery of death, the Grave Rider was prepared to enact his revenge against Alduin and Mirak.
Wonderful backstory. And now for the skills. The Grave Rider had very little to do in order to use his full powers inside of his new body. The Dragonborn had slain many dragons, further increasing his body's durability, allowing it to contain the rider's soul. And like the Grave Rider, the Dragonborn had specialized in conjuration and two-handed weapons. and because he'd become a vampire, the Dragonborn had also tapped into the magic hiding behind the power of the Necromage. The Grave Rider is a beast of raw strength, which is further fueled by the souls of those he has slain and consumed over the millennia. He is a master of souls and greatly enjoys summoning the dead to do his bidding, or raising his fallen enemies to watch them attack their former allies. Though there are many powerful enemies in Skyrim, the Rider has ensured that his new vessel will never be destroyed. While the Dragonborn wore a set of ebony plate armor, the Rider preferred something that reminded him of home. He crafted a set of dragon bone armor from the remains of Parthenax and other powerful named dragons that the Dragonborn had yet to slay. Each piece is enchanted with potent magics, ranging from increased health to stronger swings with his axe. Speaking of which, his axe that he wields is identical to the one that was used against him many centuries ago. He obtained it from a headsman in Solitude, who the Dragonborn had befriended on one of his many travels to the city. He poured the soul of Harkon into his axe, giving it a powerful life drain and fiery soul-trapping ability. The mask the Grave Rider finds in the belongings of the Dragonborn. It resonated with him, reminding him of the old days, and the new. The hood reminded him of the dragon priest garments he once wore, but the mask reminded him of death, and how he went from a living man to an undead monstrosity. Though he possesses the Dragonborn's body, he wears what he believes to be a representation of his true face. And now for the gameplay. The Grave Rider cares very little for mortals, but occasionally will find one who is deceptive, foolish, and cold-hearted that he can slay and send to the ideal masters as an offering. On occasion, he will send them the soul of a broken yet powerful individual, giving them a nice change of meal. When in combat, the Grave Rider will summon 3 undead spirits to aid him, depending on the situation. At most, he will summon a death priest, bone colossus, and a malignant zombie. Other times, he may summon denizens of the Soul Ken to fight at his side. Once his minions are summoned, he will either stand back and watch the carnage, or join in and massacre his prey. As for the powers, the Grave Rider has a few favorites in his devastating arsenal. Headsman's Barrage is a power used by the Grave Rider to cut down enemies quickly. He summons 3 Wrathmen onto the battlefield, enhances his own swings with a shout, then proceeds to hack away at his enemies with lightning speed attacks. Rider's Edge is performed by the Rider summoning his undead steed, Arvak, and running down his enemies with his mighty axe. Spirit of Vengeance is the most devastating ability that the Rider has at his disposal. He calls down a mighty storm, unleashes a roar of 1,000 dead warriors, and summons his undead minions to chase down and slaughter his prey. And now for the timeline. In his life prior to Helgen, the Dragonborn was an aspiring necromancer, though he had also dabbled as a mercenary on occasion. Upon learning of his Dragonborn abilities, he decides it's best to go after more souls and power to fuel his insatiable hunger for domination. This conquest eventually leads him to the Volkihar clan, where he quickly becomes too indispensable. His quest to gain more power to overthrow Harkon leads him to the Soul Ken, where his body is possessed and his soul devoured by the Grave Rider. From there, the Rider begins to take more control over the land of Skyrim. He starts by finishing off Harkon and claiming the Adric artifact known as Ariel's Bow. As the weeks continue, the Rider finally runs into a group of cultists, and upon searching the Dragonborn's memories, discovers that he had confronted Mirak once before, and became a vampire in order to slay him. The Rider wastes no time in heading to Solstheim, and there, on the summit of Apocrypha, he finally manages to confront and destroy his old rival. However, his vengeance is not yet complete. The rider rebuilds the blades, only using the most trusted and powerful warriors he can find, with the intent to eventually turn them into fellow grave riders. With the blades rebuilt, the rider begins to seek out a way to destroy Alduin. The Jarl of Whiterun was not prepared to help him in his plot, but the rider convinces him that he can put an end to the war. He joins one of the warring sides and quickly puts an end to the war by slaughtering hundreds of soldiers. Once Whiterun is completely safe from enemy attack, the Grave Rider traps Odahviing and forces the dragon to take him to Alduin's portal to Sovngarde. Finally, the time had come. Alduin was near, and the Grave Rider could taste the revenge. He called the dead heroes to his aid, and with them they called Alduin out into the open. Seeing the black-winged dragon approach caused the rider's blood to boil, and his rage fueled him in his attack. With a strength rivaling that of a god's, the Grave Rider slaughtered Alduin, finally destroying his once traitorous master. The Ideal Masters had watched the rider slaughter Mirak and Alduin, and it was then that they decided to call him back. He returned to the Soul Cairn and knelt before his masters, offering them many black soul gems. The masters were once necromancers who had transcended their mortal shells, but in doing so, it left them with an insatiable hunger for souls. They eagerly consumed the souls within the gems and sent out the rider with new orders. Within 70 years, all of Tamriel had been slain, their souls reaped and brought back to the Soul Cairn for the masters to feed upon. The Ideal Masters had grown so accustomed to feeding regularly that they couldn't go a day with at least 1,000 souls each. Within 100 years, all of Nirn was completely void of life. The Ideal Masters began to starve, and there were no more souls left in the Soul Cairn, aside from the rider. So they sent him to the realm of the Divines, and soon the 9 were harvested, and their souls delivered to the Ideal Masters. Each of the Masters chose their favorite Divine, but Akatosh and Talos were saved for last, so they could all partake in their delicious souls. At last, the Ideal Masters were full, but only for 1,000 years. When they awoke from their slumber, they were starving again, and so they sent the Grave Rider into the realms of oblivion. Nemira, Clavicus Vile, Sanguine, and Periite were the first 4 that the rider collected, but even such powerful souls were not enough to satiate the hunger of the Ideal Masters. Hermaeus Mora, Hircine, Chigalag, and Shigorath and Vermina were next, and though they were full, it lasted only mere days. By the end of the year, the Daedra, Magna-G, and Magnus himself had all been collected and brought to the Ideal Masters, who wasted no time in devouring their souls. The Masters knew that there were no more souls left in existence, and so they began to grow mad from starvation, until the separation. The day that the Ideal Masters were no longer connected to one another, they began to look at each other with a lustful hunger, and in secret they began to ask the rider to kill the others for them to feed on. But each time the rider refused, reminding them of the deal he made so long ago. He was bound to serve them for all time. As the ideal masters continued to persist, the rider finally gathered before them all and told them that each one had come to him, begging him to kill the others. As their anger for one another began to rise, they each came to a realization. They proclaimed that they would release him from the deal of eternal servitude, and that each would offer him a new deal, and he would only have to serve the one whose offer he prefers. He accepted, and immediately their ancient deal was broken. The weight of the arcane chains were lifted, and the rider was freed. Each of the masters prepared their own deal for him, but the rider had another idea. He reached out his hand, and the masters became bound in place. They panicked and tried to move, but to no avail. The rider revealed that since the Third Era, he'd begun to consume portions of the souls he collected for the masters. During the last 100 years, he had been giving them smaller and smaller portions of souls. When he collected the souls of the Aedra, Daedra, and Celestial beings, he had consumed more than half of their souls, including the consumption of all the souls of the Daedric minions. With all that power, the rider was able to finally enact his greatest revenge, killing the ideal masters who he learned orchestrated the attack on Sarthal. With a wave of his hand, the rider ripped the ideal masters from their soul gems and devoured them whole. There was nothing left. The rider was floating amidst a sea of endless darkness. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, he caused a new universe to form. He carefully crafted every tree, animal, and eventually began to work on the mortals. He made many other worlds, and filled the darkness with stars, and a sun close enough to illuminate the planets he had made. He did not touch the planets or their inhabitants, and after 1,000 years of tedious work, he rested. There was peace and quiet throughout the entire universe. We hope you enjoyed our latest build, the Grave Rider. If you haven't already, then please hit that like button, subscribe, and smack the bell icon to be notified of our future videos. Have a great rest of your week, everybody, and we'll see you all here next time on the Morbid Veil.